Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Episode 7. First Continent, First Gospel. The African Memory of Mark. When we think about Africa's ties to Christianity, it's hard to get much bigger than St. Mark. As one of the foremost evangelists of early Christianity, Mark was a certified big deal, and church legends state that he traveled to Africa and founded many of its earliest and longest-running ecclesial communities. The Coptic Church of Egypt today claims St. Mark as its founder and its first bishop. But it's not just Egypt that claims him. Churches in Numidia, Libya, and Ethiopia all lay claim to St. Mark as their patron and founder. As often happens, these churches have preserved all kinds of stories and biographical details about St. Mark that alter how we might understand the man, and even understand the Bible. Today we're going to investigate the traditions about St. Mark that were preserved in the memory of the African Church. But already you might be thinking, that's a mouthful, Ben. Why do you say the traditions that were preserved in the historical memory of the African Church? Why don't you just say the history of St. Mark's adventures in Africa? Well, the answer is because historians are not actually sure that St. Mark was ever in Africa. The African churches sure think that Mark was there, but there is almost zero historical evidence that Mark ever went there. The book of Acts records some of Mark's travels across the Mediterranean, but it never mentions Mark going to Africa. Now, this is not, in and of itself, very surprising. We don't actually have much good evidence for what any of the evangelists were doing or where they were going in biblical times. The only exception we have is Paul, and that's mostly because he wrote a bunch of letters telling everybody where he was all the time, usually right before or right after telling them to stop all of the dumb stuff they were doing. The other evangelists probably traveled too, they were just less literary about it than Paul was. And the book of Acts stops following Mark's journeys way before Mark dies. African tradition holds that Mark came to the continent later in his life, so the fact that Acts doesn't mention it makes sense. However, serious historians are loath to say that something happened just because the oral tradition of a church says it happened. That's not necessarily because they're anti-religious, it's just because there are often pressures for communities to have an illustrious founder. And if they don't have one, sometimes they just invent one. A clear example of this is a document called the Letter to the Laodiceans. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul asks the Colossians to send on a letter to the church in Laodicea. We have no idea what this letter contained, but we do know that a short, spurious letter of about 20 verses emerged, claiming to be this fabled epistle. Basically, everybody has agreed that this is bunk. I mean, first of all, can you imagine Paul containing himself to 20 verses? I mean, even Philemon was 25 verses, and that was a miracle in and of itself. But if you are, say, a Christian in Laodicea, and all the other churches get awesome letters written to them by an apostle, and you know that you were supposed to get a letter, but you don't have a letter, and you're feeling down and you want a letter, you can see how you might be tempted to believe somebody who told you they'd found your lost letter. In Simeon's wake, now brought to you by the Roman postal system. So that's the case against these stories being historical. However, there are others who say it's silly to dismiss the traditions of a church altogether. After all, it's not like the church is a monolith where everybody would have immediately agreed to make up a story and never tell anybody the truth. The church had its own procedures for testing and verifying traditions, and clearly the tradition of a Markan origin for the African church passed those tests. not just with the Africans, but with churches in Syria, Rome, Palestine, etc. Moreover, the historians who doubt the historicity of these traditions tend to be white, European, or American men. They don't tend to be people who have a deep connection with the African church, its traditions, or procedures. Long story short, the reason that I call this an episode about the memory of Mark rather than the history of Mark is because I'm trying to sidestep this debate. It's not that I don't have an opinion on it, I do. I think it's highly unlikely the African church would have come up with such a rich set of stories about Mark if he hadn't been a significant figure for them. I mean, it's not like Mark was the most famous or impressive of the apostles. If they were making up a figure to follow, I imagine they would have picked someone like John, the disciple Jesus loved, or Peter. I mean, Peter founded the church in Antioch and oversaw the church in Rome, so it wouldn't have been a big stretch to just add a third church to his authority. At the same time, that does not mean every single detail we have about Mark in the African church should be taken as gospel truth. It should be taken as part of the story that African churches told and tell about themselves. And viewed in that light, it is indisputably history. But most of all, there are a lot of stories about Mark that are just way too fun not to share. I will let serious historians argue about whether this or that story is probable in light of some half-destroyed inscription somebody found somewhere. I respect their work, but it sounds boring, and I don't care. I want to talk about Mark running an Airbnb for Jesus, taming lions, and maybe cutting off his own thumb? Maybe. I don't know. We'll decide what's true when we get there. So, let's start at the beginning. The first bit of data that the Egyptian church has is a tradition about Mark's place of birth. You might have guessed that Mark hailed from Palestine, since he tends to hang around with people from Palestine like, every single one of the apostles, and Jesus. But you would be wrong, according to the African churches. According to them, Mark was actually born in an extremely cool-sounding region called the Pentapolis. The less cool translation of that name is just 5 cities. If you look at a modern map and find the northeast corner of Libya, you'll see a little bit of land that juts just a little bit further north into the Mediterranean Sea than the area around it. That's the Pentapolis region. Mark was apparently born right there, right around the city of Cyrene, to a family of observant Jews from the tribe of Levi. That would have made Mark's family eligible to serve as priests, although since priests could only do their priest thing in Jerusalem, they probably weren't in that line of work. We know that there was a thriving community of Jews in Cyrene who had migrated there during a bout of oppression in the 4th century BC. Mark's family was particularly well connected to religious superstars. They knew many of the scriptures by heart, and Mark's father was related to Simon Peter. Yes, that Simon Peter, the "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church" Simon Peter. He was related to him by marriage. But they were having a rough time of it in Mark's childhood because the city of Cyrene kept getting raided by organized bands of pirates in the area. Apparently, there weren't enough soldiers to keep them at bay, and the Rome of the 1st century didn't really care about Libya. I mean, they didn't want to lose it, don't get me wrong, but they were way too busy fighting on other fronts and continuing to convert themselves into an empire to care over much about what a bunch of raiders were doing in a small area of little strategic significance. So Mark's family moved, and they moved to Jerusalem of all places. Perhaps they wanted to ply the family trade at the priesthood. Or maybe they just figured they wanted to be around other Jews, and if they couldn't do that in Cyrene, Jerusalem was the next best place. Either way, they got to the Holy Land. And that is where things truly start to get interesting. For in African traditions, Mark's family hosted a certain Jesus of Nazareth during the events of Holy Week. That's right. That upper room the disciples and Jesus had the Last Supper in, that room was in Mark's childhood home. And not only that, the Gospels also record that the disciples were gathered in the upper room of a house when the Spirit came upon them at Pentecost. The major events of salvation history unfolded quite literally in Mark's living room. Now, I do have to tell you that I find the reasoning for this tradition especially strained. In Mark's Gospel, when the disciples enter Jerusalem, Jesus tells them to find a man carrying a pitcher of water on his head and to follow him to find the house that they're supposed to stay at. African churches will tell you that this water-carrying man was Mark, who brought Jesus back to his house. Now, why do they say that? It's unclear. The only reference we have at all to Mark's house is in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, where it says Peter ran to Mark's mother and her house after escaping imprisonment. That doesn't prove anything at all about where Jesus and Peter were years earlier during the Last Supper. Although I suppose you could argue that if there was one place Peter would feel safe, it would be with a family that was well known, and had housed them during similar periods of fear and uncertainty. But more to the point, there is a certain theological resonance to it. You may remember that Jesus had already sheltered in Africa once before. When Herod the Great learned of Christ's birth and tried to have him killed, Jesus' family fled to Egypt, which is where he spent his boyhood years. Africa had sheltered Jesus from a murderous tyrant's rage in his youth. Now, in the days leading up to his death, an African family provided him shelter from those who sought his life. Ancient African theologians have some marvelous memories of the Last Supper. Writing in the city of Alexandria, the great interpreter Origen describes Mark's mother preparing the meal. She readies the blood of the grape, the bread of the word. Then, when the disciples leave the house to go to the Mount of Olives where Jesus would be arrested, Mark and his mother joined them. They sang songs along the way, foreshadowing the songs the redeemed will sing at the end of time, the songs that the prophet Isaiah said would accompany the Messiah. So Mark's family was a certified big deal, at least by the time of Acts, perhaps by the time of the Gospels themselves. But what about Mark? What about him? Well, the tradition remembers him as a pious young lad. Mark was probably about a half-generation younger than the original 12 disciples, so he grew up around them, but not as one of them. His faith was no less sincere than theirs, though. Mark hung around Peter's house a lot and apparently learned the faith from the soon-to-be disciple. He learned so well he even converted his own father. The story goes that one day father and son were having a stroll through the wilderness near the Jordan River, as one does, when 2 lions appeared. Dad panicked and yelled for Mark to run and save himself. Dad's plan was to endure the assault of both lions, Mufasa style, to give his son time to flee. And Mark said, "Nah." Okay, Mark was a little bit more pious than that. Actually, what he did is he prayed. He said, "Christ, in whose hands our lives are committed, will not let them prey on us." And then he prayed that Jesus would save him from the lions, and the lions immediately ceased their attack. I kind of like to imagine that Jesus pointed a giant laser pointer from the sky, and they ran away after the mysterious red dot that had appeared. In Simeon's Wake, now brought to you by Ben's imagination. Have you ever dreamed? Well, Ben does. Have you ever had weird melatonin dreams? Ben has those all the time, even when he doesn't take melatonin. It's like a surrealist movie theater that he can't stop. And that has given Ben a big imagination. Imagination. The world isn't interesting? Go to the movie theater in your head that plays fake arguments that you win. Fake stories that are more fun than the real one. The power of imagination, making the ordinary bearable, and the extraordinary even more so, since circa 1 million BC. Anyway, back to the story. However Jesus got the lions away, Mark's dad was duly impressed, and he told Mark, "Please say more about this Jesus Christ fellow." Because Mark was a respectful young man, he did not say, "Dude, you know this guy. We had him over for that really hectic Passover, plus your cousin is married to his disciple's sister." He could have said that, but he didn't. Instead, he instructed his father and then baptized him into the Christian religion. Mark also likely appears in the Gospel himself. You may remember that odd incident in Mark chapter 14, verse 51. Jesus has just been arrested, and there is a young man following him who runs away. A guard tries to seize him, but he grabs onto the young man's tunic, which tears, and the man runs away naked while the guard holds the tunic. Most scholars think that young man is Mark himself, who is telling what he knows of the story while modestly concealing the fact that he was quite literally butt naked during the events of the Passion. Because Mark spent so much time observing the events of Christ's life, Coptic Christians often give him a special title, the Beholder of God. Besides being a very cool name, this title highlighted that even though Mark was not one of the 12 original apostles, he was still an eyewitness to the foundational events of the Christian faith. This was especially important to the African churches that sprang from his ministry. Mark was their primary link to Jesus Christ himself. Mark had taught them what the gospel was all about. Mark led their churches and baptized them, and Mark duly appointed leaders in his stead as his earthly life drew to a close. If people were going to change their lives for this church, if they were going to give their lives for this church, as many indeed were asked to do, they were encouraged by the knowledge that their leaders were living links in a chain that went all the way back to Christ himself. The idea or hope was that this ensured the faithful transmission of the faith. Each leader was appointed in an orderly, public fashion by someone who had themselves been authorized to lead, and that authorization went back all the way to Jesus himself. That may seem like overkill to you, but when faith is a matter of life or death, it matters very much whether you got your faith from someone who beheld God or someone who just heard about him. If St. Mark was the beholder of God, there was one other person that he was the beholder of, St. Paul. If you have read the book of Acts lately, you know that it depicts Mark traveling extensively with Paul. Mark may have even been on Paul's journeys before Acts records them, having not yet achieved a reputation to merit being listed among Paul's companions. Their relationship was not always smooth, though. At one point, Paul refused to take Mark on a missionary journey because he felt Mark had abandoned him in an earlier mission. The Bible does not say why, although you can find no small amount of speculation on the internet if you search. However, there appears to be a tradition that Mark and Paul reconciled before the end. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, Paul asks Timothy to bring Mark to him because he is useful in ministry. Now, as a history podcaster, I feel compelled to point out that most scholars are pretty dang sure that the historical Paul didn't write 2 Timothy. It was almost certainly written by a later disciple of Paul who used his teacher's name to write letters, a not uncommon practice in antiquity. But this does suggest that there was a tradition that the two reconciled. And then, of course, there is Mark's close relationship with Peter, his relative by marriage. African Christian sources make a lot out of Mark and Peter's relationship. Mark was with Peter when he was martyred in Rome sometime during the reign of the Emperor Nero. Peter instructed Mark in the faith, and Peter commissioned Mark to write his gospel. Seriously. The story goes that Peter, knowing he was likely about to die, sat Mark down in Rome and asked him to commit Peter's teachings to writing. Mark dutifully complied, and the result is the Gospel of Mark. Now, this is one of those church traditions that has a fascinating ring of truth about it. One of the things that modern Bible scholars notice is that the Gospel of Mark contains a lot of information about Peter. In Mark, Peter is the first to confess Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus calls Peter the rock on which he will build his church, and Peter's denial of Christ during the Passion is a big, big, big deal. Now hold on, you may say, don't Matthew and Luke tell those stories too? What's so special about Mark? A good question. To make a long story short, most scholars today think that Matthew and Luke base their Gospels on Mark. So they are basically just copying Mark's notes when it comes to those stories about Peter. And Mark adds other details that we don't always see elsewhere, like Peter being the first disciple to be called by Christ. Thus, Mark's close relationship with Peter is not just familial, but literary. Ancient African Christians saw him as the heir to the stories and teachings of the great Peter, and themselves as the preservers of those teachings. But all this still leaves unanswered the question, why did Mark go to Africa? Was he just missing the comforts of his ancestral home? Did the disciples draw straws and he got the Africa straw? The answer, as is so often in the church, is that he went to Africa because God told him to. The 10th century bishop and historian Cyrus reports the traditional story as follows, and I quote, "After Jesus' ascension into heaven, Mark went with Peter to Jerusalem, and they preached the word of God to the multitudes. And the Holy Ghost appeared to Peter and commanded him to go to the cities and villages which were in that country. So Peter and Mark with him went to the district of Bethany and preached the word of God, and Peter remained there some days. And he saw in a dream the angel of God, who said to him, 'In 2 places there is great lack.' So Peter said to the angel, 'Which places do you mean?' He said to him, 'The city of Alexandria in Egypt and the land of Rome.' It was decided that Peter would carry the gospel to Rome, and his associate Mark would carry it to Alexandria and then to the rest of Egypt. The Holy Ghost, perhaps not wishing Mark to be left out of the divine visions, apparently appeared to him and said to Mark, 'Rise and go to the city of Alexandria to sow there the good seed, which is the word of God.' And when he was in Egypt, Mark would find the gospel growing in some very interesting soil. Mark's very first convert in Alexandria was a cobbler by the name of Anianos. When Mark entered the city, he noticed his shoe had broken, so he found a cobbler to repair it. That cobbler was Anianos. While Anianos was repairing Mark's shoe, he accidentally cut his finger and yelled out, 'God is one!' Now, I'm going to tell you something that the African churches typically don't in their tradition. Think about the last time you cut yourself and might have wanted to yell out a sentence beginning with the word God. Was it a particularly nice sentence you were planning to utter? I'm guessing not. But perhaps someone was around and you caught yourself and finished your sentence with something like, 'God bless!' I suspect that is what is happening here. The cobbler is hurt, but has company and is trying to restrain from swearing. But where the cobbler sees pain, Mark sees an opportunity for theological discussion. While Anianos is still nursing his hand, Mark asks, 'If you know there is one God, then why do you worship many different gods?' The cobbler replies that they mention the one God, but they don't know who he is, so they can't really worship him. Then Mark spits on the ground, makes some clay, puts it on the cobbler's wound, and it is miraculously healed. You may remember this is exactly the way Jesus heals a blind man in John's Gospel, by spitting and making mud. The cobbler was quite impressed by this and converted to Christianity. When Mark later had to leave the city of Alexandria due to the threat of violence, he appointed Anianos as the first bishop of the city. So be careful whom you almost cuss around. You might wind up getting consecrated for it. Of course, Anianos wasn't ordained on the spot. Mark would spend some time leading the burgeoning church personally before he handed off any responsibilities. But he would hand them off fairly quickly. Mark had other places to see and churches to plant. More important than that wanderlust, though, was the fact that Mark's life was endangered by his continued presence in Alexandria. The danger came from much the same source as that facing the other evangelists: pagan artisans angry that Christians were cutting into their profit margins. As I have told you for several episodes running now, Roman law basically said that religions that refused to pay homage to the gods of Rome were prohibited. There was an exception to this policy through a grandfather clause. If your religion was old enough that your grandfather had practiced it, then you got to keep practicing it, even if it meant you didn't worship the Roman pantheon. Judaism met this criterion. Christianity did not. And you've also heard me say that Romans rarely enforced these rules because, well, they didn't really care. Christianity was illegal, but most Christians were seen as harmless weirdos. They may not have been liked, but they often were not persecuted for what was essentially a victimless crime. That reputation may not have been helped by St. Mark, who, supposedly, after becoming a Christian, cut off his thumb. Now, why on earth would he have done this? Well, first of all, I'm not sure that he actually did. The sources on this are kinda sketchy, even by the standards of late antiquity. However, the idea appears to be that Mark wanted to firmly distance himself from his Levitical upbringing. So he cut off his thumb. Why? Well, because priests who were missing various appendages were not allowed to serve in the temple under Levitical law. Of course, it's not like anybody was pointing a spear at a Levite's head and saying, serve in the temple or you're gonna get it. So, he could have just, continued to choose not to go. That's one of the reasons why this whole thumb-cutting business tends to be met with a lot of skepticism, both inside and outside the church. Still, though, rumors have a way of spreading, and any Roman who heard that story was going to think Mark was a little extra weird. Thankfully, in Roman law, as today, there is no prohibition against being weird. However, there are economic consequences. For there was one victim of Christianity's rise, metalsmiths and woodworkers, who made a living creating idols. As you probably know, Christians were pretty firm about their whole no idols policy. And while they were a small percentage of the population, Christians were overrepresented among the wealthy elite. Exactly the sort of people who could place large orders for idol makers to fulfill. It didn't take many converts to make a substantial dent in their profit margins. Which, according to tradition, is precisely what happened. In the year 68 AD, St. Mark was celebrating the Eucharist with his church in Alexandria. It was a particularly important occasion. It happened to fall on the day when the church celebrated Easter, and also the date that the Egyptian pagans had a festival for one of their gods called Serapis. As Mark led worship, an angry crowd of pagans, stirred up by the idol makers, gathered around him. Eventually, they broke through the worshippers and tied St. Mark up. Then they tied him to a horse and dragged him along the city streets, calling him a bull. This was apparently meant to mock St. Mark, who had helped the Alexandrian Christians build a church in the section of town called the Place of Cows. They dragged him to that church, crying along the way, "Drag this dragon to the Place of Cows." As he was dragged along, St. Mark called out to Christ and thanked him for making Mark worthy of suffering for the gospel. He died along the way. He left a rich legacy through his apostolic preaching, his faithful pastoring of churches, and his heroic martyrdom. His preaching throughout Africa ensured that Mark would be remembered not just as the father of the Egyptian church, but of all African Christianity. What can we learn about Christianity on this continent through the traditions about St. Mark? Well, there are surely many things we can learn. I'm fascinated by the way these traditions place Mark at critical moments in the gospel stories. He was with Jesus at his arrest. His family housed Jesus during Holy Week. And there's another tradition that tells us Mark was one of the servants who brought Jesus the water that he turned into wine at the wedding in Cana. What is going on with these stories? Why is St. Mark appearing? And if he was there the whole time, why does the Bible never mention him by name? There are a couple of possible answers. Let me start with the most cynical one. The most cynical answer is that St. Mark wasn't mentioned because he wasn't there. The Bible didn't name all the members of the crowds around Jesus because they weren't important. Over the course of time, it is common for anonymous sayings to become attributed to worthy or famous people. We actually see this process playing out all the time today on the internet. If you Google Albert Einstein quotes, you can find a million different things that the great scientist never said, all attributed to him, usually next to that famous picture of him sticking his tongue out. Just so in the ancient world. Ancient readers, like modern ones, hated anonymity. So the traditions about St. Mark are little more than legends designed to satisfy the reader's curiosity and buttress the apostolic credentials of the Egyptian church. That's the most cynical possibility, but it's only one. Here is another, somewhat less cynical one. For ancient Christians, authority was really, really important. You couldn't just stand up and say God wanted you to lead a church. Your authority had to be given to you by someone who was given it by someone else. This is one of the reasons why many churches have long lists of succession. These lists show which bishop succeeded which bishop all the way back to the apostles and then to Christ himself. It's not just a history exercise. They are trying to show that there is an unbroken chain of authority that they are following. This is especially important for the churches of Africa because Mark wasn't mentioned as ever having seen Jesus face to face. While it wasn't impossible to have an apostle who hadn't hung out with the incarnate Christ, just look at Paul, it mattered quite a bit whether Mark was just a precocious disciple of Paul or whether he was, as the Coptic Church puts it, a beholder of God. Those traditions exist to emphasize that Mark had an historical link to Jesus of Nazareth. Whether those traditions are true is another matter. Even less cynically, one could just say that the African traditions are filling in historical records that were only partially written down. This is actually a pretty common practice in antiquity. Books were really expensive to produce and maintain, so most ancient authors would only write down the most crucial bits. Especially with sacred texts, it was often thought that authors had passed down an oral tradition alongside the book, and that oral tradition expanded upon what was written down. All these stories about Mark, just one part of that tradition. Those are three different opinions about all this from an historical perspective. You are free to take them or leave them depending on your personal balance of cynicism and credibility. But let me add a fourth perspective that is not so much historical as literary. What if Mark's absence in the text mirrors Africa's absence in discourse? See, Mark is always there in the traditions. He's following Jesus through his entire life. He doesn't draw attention to himself, but he is there nonetheless, listening and learning until it is his time to lead. Africa, too, is there all throughout the Christian story. The Holy Family takes shelter in Africa from Herod's wrath. The languages of Africa are spoken on the day of Pentecost, and there is at least one African prominently featured in the Gospel by name. Simon of Cyrene. Yes, the same Cyrene Mark was born right outside of, who carries the cross of Christ when Jesus is too exhausted to do it himself. And yet, when we tell the story about the spread of the church, we often talk about it spreading through Europe and Asia. We talk about Paul's journeys, not Mark's. Is the silence of St. Mark, ironically, maybe even providentially, mirroring the silence with which we have so often treated African Christianity? Riffing on this, one can also read the African Mark as offering a different model of discipleship from the others. Because, after all, the only disciple who really gets significant screen time in the New Testament is Peter. And Peter is, forgive me, a loudmouth. He has so many opinions, and his tongue tends to be faster than his brain. He rushes headfirst into situations, messes up, repents, and then figures out what he should have probably done in the first place. A Mark who was silently present throughout Christ's ministry offers another model. He waits and listens. He is patient. He is perhaps more humble than Peter. And he fathers churches no less numerous or significant than those of Peter. It may not be a mere quirk of history that traditions say Peter and Mark were related. Like family, they were very different from each other. And like family, they needed each other to be whole. Whatever you make of Mark's biblical presence, or lack thereof, it is only one aspect of his rich legacy to the churches of the African continent. While Simeon may have been the first to evangelize in Africa, Mark built the organizational structures that defined the church there. And not to put too fine a point on it, but Africa was a big deal, especially the city of Alexandria. In fact, in the first century, it was Rome's only rival as the greatest city in the empire. Antioch could put up a convincing performance if you squinted right, but really it was down between Rome and Alexandria. So to found the Church of Alexandria was no mean feat indeed, or the churches in Libya, where Mark also preached. To the early generations of these churches, St. Mark was not a legend or historical figure. He was someone they had met, remembered, and retold stories about. If you know a church person, you probably know a bit of what this is like. Some people tell stories of the beloved pastor who served your congregation 10, 20, 30 years ago. Perhaps they remember how that pastor touched their lives, changed them. Now imagine that pastor was a literal apostle who had known the real Jesus Christ, and you can get a sense of Mark's presence as a real live person. The stories we have about him portray him as a gentle, earnest, but direct soul. And it may be that these qualities are what the stories are really intended to capture about him, quite apart from any other historical details. Mark was the father of these churches, and they saw him as a father figure. Indeed, in Coptic he was known as the first Papa, which later turned into the word Pope. The Bishop of Rome is now called the Pope by Roman Catholics, but the Coptic Orthodox Church also gives that title to the Archbishop of Alexandria. He is the Coptic Pope, even to the present day. That word has come to symbolize many things over the course of 2 millennia, but in the beginning it signified a close family connection. Mark cared for the church like a father cares for a small child, and the church remembered it as such. Of course, the memory of Mark takes shape in the church in myriad other ways. The story of his taming of the lions inspired the church, and it's part of why the lion is associated with St. Mark in so much traditional Christian art. The fact that the lion is also a symbol of the African continent is a suspiciously fortuitous coincidence. It shaped how the church read Mark's gospel, and in the other 4 gospels as well. His legacy is long, and whatever the real history of his ministry is, his very memory has indelibly shaped the African church. But no figure gets to claim the whole of African Christianity for himself, not even a gospel writer. Mark was a link in a chain, a crucial link, vital even, but his spiritual descendants would have to carry the message forward into their own day. And even if they never met, Mark's mission was spiritually indebted to all those Christians who had journeyed into Africa already. In the end, Mark was traveling as his churches would travel, in Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.